Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is October 30th, 2025 at 7:39 a.m. So this will be the first time on video I've done something like this. So I'm going to discuss the John F. Kennedy assassination and what I know about it. In my original video, made a few days ago, I mentioned this policeman named Gary Ween who gave me the advice that was actually critical to my springing Dennis from jail with my professor. And Gary had my everlasting gratitude for that. He really went out of his way to help me. And again, we had shared trauma, let's say, of the same gangsters who ruined my life, ruined Gary's life. And so, but Gary didn't take it lying down. Neither did I. But Gary, being an ex sailor in World War II, gunner, an LAPD cop, all this kind of stuff. Gary was much more a warrior than I am. And in fact, Gary, once I sprung Dennis from jail, again, I was done with my heroics. And but Gary and we had a friendship for the rest of his life. Gary died in 2004. Um, And when I read Gary's book, when Dennis's wife handed me his book, which led to me meeting Gary, etc., there was a chapter in the book which was about his encounter with the John Kennedy assassination. Um, and it was quite a story. When I read it, I was busy trying to save Dennis's life, so I really wasn't, too didn't pay that much attention. My father, he always felt that John Kennedy's assassination was a conspiracy and that it had been covered up. And so I guess, on board with that, although I really didn't pay it too much attention. It really wasn't something that I was that interested in, really. But when I read Gary's chapter on this book, that began my journey of looking into the John Kennedy assassination. And anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to get into that. Um, Gary, and I'll preface this with Gary wrote a chapter of his book based on his involvement in the aftermath of the John Kennedy assassination. And he described a plan that hatched by the CIA, that was intended to frame Fidel Castro for a fake assassination attempt on John Kennedy to justify an invasion of Cuba. And this is the essence of what Gary's reporting was. And in 1970, after he was railroaded out of his career, he actually apparently told people about this event. And then his book in 1987 came out, which had this chapter in there. And then 10 years later, in 1997, Operation Northwoods was declassified, actually as part of the JFK declassification effort. And Operation Northwoods was the Pentagon's plan to frame Castro for terrorist incidents to justify an invasion of Cuba. And so it was sort of the identical operation, but that was the Pentagon's version versus the CIA's version. And in my opinion, once Northwoods got declassified, Gary's account should become the centerpiece of all JFK assassination theorizing ever since. It hasn't, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing this video, because Gary's account deserves far more recognition than it has so far. And the interesting thing is today, all the leading theories about the JFK assassination is essentially Gary's reporting, minus the interposed operation. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to get into it with a brief sketch of Gary had to report what he experienced, and then what I learned over my studies for the past 35 years of this issue. So anyway, so Gary was this LAPD cop who part of his job was putting Mickey Cohen under surveillance. And Mickey Cohen was the gangster, the Jewish mobster who ran the LA crime scene. He used to work for Al Capone. In fact, he was good friends with Bugsy Siegel. In fact, Cohen actually was one who started the race wire in Vegas. And in fact, as Gary learned, Cohen rigged horse races. Duh, right? So anyway, so Cohen rigged horse races. In fact, Cohen, uh, I think as an attempt to bribe Gary, actually gave him all the winners one night at the racetrack. And Gary actually won a couple $1,000 that night back in 1947. Because Gary directed traffic at Hollywood Park where these races took place. And in fact, when Gary was directing traffic, and again, he actually gave Cohen and his entourage the royal treatment, stop traffic to let his limo through. Gary did that also part of his surveillance duties, seeing who was with Cohen. And one time he saw a guy in the back seat with Cohen, who he never seen before. And Cohen's, as Gary said, Cohen's hoods would not ride in the back with Cohen, but VIPs would. Anyway, so there was some VIP back in the back seat with Cohen, and this is 1946. And then the next year, Gary again in the surveillance with Cohen run around. He actually walked into a restaurant. I think it was a Yiddish restaurant, and Cohen wasn't there, but this guy he saw in the back of the limousine was there. And Gary walks up to the guy, and Gary was, not in his uniform, but I think this guy knew Gary was a cop, and he introduced himself as Jack Ruby. And anyway, and Ruby was very voluble, talking. In fact, later on, Ruby was known for his kind of big mouth, and but he was frankly just talking to Gary about how since World War II is over, the West Coast is no longer the real happening place for the mob, and they were going to focus their operations in New Orleans and Havana. And Ruby actually had, his name was Jacob Rubenstein. He was this Jewish gangster who also worked for Al Capone early in his career. Um, and he had a big ring with a big ruby on it, so he was sort of branding himself, I guess, as Jack Ruby. And so, and then Gary ran into Ruby one more time in Cohen's company not long after that when Gary was trying to doing plainclothes work trying to uncover bookie operations. And then anyway, Cohen and Ruby stumbled into this bar where Gary was doing his work, and Gary knew that they knew who he was, so he got out of there fast. And that was the last time he saw Jack Ruby or heard about Jack Ruby until 1963 when Ruby shot Oswald. So this was Gary's first encounter with what became the JFK assassination milieu was his encounters with Jack Ruby back in 46, 47. Yeah, so Jack Ruby was not this small-time nightclub owner that the Warren Commission depicted him as. He was a high-ranking mobster. I mean, not high-ranking enough to avoid his duties for killing Oswald, but he was a high-ranking mobster. So definitely the mob was involved in the John Kennedy assassination. But that's really not the big revelation from Gary and his involvement in the JFK assassination. And so Gary, um, again, he was a gunner. He was a naval gunner in World War II in the Pacific Theater, and like so many American men, in fact, once the when World War II was over, the ships, all the naval ships and everything, all the transports from Europe and Pacific, once they debarked in California and the East Coast, the soldiers were on their own to get home. you know, it was like, and that's actually where the hitchhiking phenomenon really became big, was that it was sort of like your national duty to pick up these men trying to get home from the war. So picking up hitchhikers back then was sort of like a national duty. Well, a lot of the men, particularly in California, they just never went home. So Gary was from Iowa originally, and but he never left the West Coast. And so anyway, and Gary got married. And in 1946, he became a cop. joined the LA police force, so the LAPD cop, and that's how he ended up putting Mickey Cohen under surveillance. And anyway, what happened though was Gary became very good friends with Audie Murphy, and it's 30 years ago, I could say Audie Murphy and everybody knew who he was. But today, when I tell this story to younger people, I go, "You ever heard Audie Murphy?" And most of them go, "No." And so this is dating me, right? I'm an old man now. And so, but for you younger viewers, Audie Murphy was the most decorated American soldier ever. And so Murphy was in World War II during the American uh, invasion, after the Normandy invasions, et cetera, on the road to Berlin. And so yeah, so Audie Murphy was part of that. Also, he was in Italy, et cetera. And so anyway, he was in Europe for a few years. Murphy, he was an orphan from I think Dallas County. So he was actually from that part of Texas, and actually was small. He was over five, not much more than 5 feet tall, but grew up, knowing how to shoot, etc. And he became America's most decorated war soldier. And his greatest, most celebrated feat was holding off an entire uh, hundreds of Nazis single-handedly during early 1945. And anyway, it was one of the most heroic feats of any war. And he did all of his heroic feats before he turned 20. He all did it as a teenager. And so anyway, so when Murphy finally came home, he became a movie star. So he went to Hollywood. And yeah, there's really nobody like Murphy in the United States today. And but anyway, so Murphy though he was in Hollywood, married actually a Hollywood starlet. Murphy had his own private plane, all this kind of stuff. And so anyway, he became good friends with Gary. And I don't know exactly how they kindled their friendship, but they were a couple of ex-soldiers, and anyway, they were tight, really close friends. And Audie, being from the Dallas area, again, he became this national celebrity. And one of his good friends was Bill Decker, and Bill Decker was the sheriff of Dallas County. In fact, Lee Harvey Oswald died while being transferred to Decker's custody from the Dallas City Jail to the Dallas County Jail. And Decker occasionally would actually come to Los Angeles on business. In fact, Decker was a really famous lawman. He helped end Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree, etc. And so anyway, so Decker would come through Los Angeles on business periodically. And anyway, and when he would, Gary would actually arrange to reserve a table at the Los Angeles Police Academy, and Gary and Audie and Bill Decker would have lunch. And in this meeting in 1963, December, also Gary's investigative partner was there. By that time, Gary had become an investigator for the LA's public defender's office in Los Angeles, the district attorney. And what happened was that about, I guess this is 2 weeks after the John Kennedy assassination, and uh, Decker came to town. Gary reserved a table, and then they had lunch together at the police academy. And the conversation they were having, Gary said, was a conversation that all arms experts in the country were having at that time, which was that there's no way Lee Harvey Oswald could have put a couple bullets in Jack Kennedy from his sniper's nest in the book depository, which is just with that cheap Italian rifle. Just no way. And in fact, Decker and Murphy were particularly experts with this exact kind of rifle that Oswald would theoretically use in the assassination. And anyway, and so they're all talking over this, like there's no way Oswald could have done that. And at the end of their conversation, where they all agreed to that, Decker said, "Well, I've got I know Oswald didn't do it, and I have a guy in Dallas who knows Oswald didn't do it, and he wants to talk to somebody who's not associated with the feds. And he said, Audie, would you be interested in talking with him? And Audie was like, could be. And so anyway, so they have their meeting, they leave, and about a day or two later, Audie calls Gary. She says, "You want to take a trip?" And so anyway, so about a few days, several days later, like the next week, Audie and he had his own private plane, and so he flew with Gary and Gary's investigative part, and they flew to an airstrip in Rio Doce, New Mexico. Reynoso and Decker came across from Dallas with this guy who wanted to talk to somebody, and the guy's name was John. And in fact, in Gary's original book, he just said he was John, some kind of military guy. And I'll reveal his identity a little later here. But anyway, so John, they meet at the airport and they go to a diner there in Ruidoso, and John starts to tell a story. And what he said was is that Lee Harvey Oswald was a military intelligence operative, and his whole teenage fascination with communism and his learning Russian when he was working for the Marine Corps, and when he was working on a highly sensitive U-2 base there in Japan, and his defection to the Soviet Union, all of that was actually his grooming in his military intelligence career to give him basically fake communist credentials so he could infiltrate communist organizations. And this was apparently this was common back then. In fact, Victor Marchetti, in fact, my friend Ralph McGehee, who I will eventually do a video on, Ralph and Victor Marchetti were the only two CIA career employees who wrote critical memoirs of the CIA and actually went through the uh, national security process to get their books published. And both of them have epic legal battles to get their books published because the CIA tried to block publication of their books. In fact, both books are riddled with censorship deletions as the CIA tried to cover up everything about what it really does. And Marchetti actually said that when Oswald defected, so-called defected to the Soviet Union, there was a program that the Navy had of these fake defectors, and there were a few dozen of these young men who supposedly were disaffected. They were disenchanted with the West, and they wanted to go to the Soviet Union to check out communism. But it was all part of an intelligence operation, and Oswald was almost certainly part of that operation. So he was a fake defector. And so then he comes back with a Russian wife a couple years later. And in fact, when he defected, Oswald defected, he threatened to reveal national security secrets. And he actually was he had a security clearance working at the U-2 base there in Japan. And in fact, not long after that, the U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union. And in fact, the guy who got shot down thinks that Oswald might have been there for some of his interrogation. So anyway, so Oswald, in fact, when he brought his wife home, his wife was KGB, and this has come out that she actually was assigned to Oswald. So anyway, so Oswald was certainly no lone nut commie guy. He was part of an involved military intelligence career, and that this is what he did. In fact, many years later, it came out that David Ferrie, who was also part of the JFK assassination milieu with the Cuban exiles, etc., Oswald Ferrie ran this teenage group of aspiring cadets, and Oswald was part of his troop, like a Boy Scout troop. In fact, a photograph came out of that, and in fact, the bunkers try to dismiss all this. Oh, it was just a coincidence that Oswald would have been there. Ferry as his den master when he was a teenager. And actually, that was when Oswald began his so-called communist fascination, when he was actually roped into being that. In fact, and I've written about this plan, but I had a relative who was a CIA contract agent who almost tried to recruit me into the family business. He worked for Henry Kissinger. And I'll have another video about that. But I almost got recruited in that, my attempt to recruit me to that myself. So I'm definitely understanding and sympathetic of a young man who was recruited into something like that. And so, and obviously ultimately ruined Oswald's life, ended his life prematurely, and he's been vilified to this day. But he was actually a soldier, following orders. And so, but anyway, so uh, to get back to this meeting, though, so this guy named John's telling about Oswald and his military intelligence background and what he was doing. And what happened was when he came back from the Soviet Union with his Russian wife, he went into this sort of general talent pool. In fact, my relative was also, he seemed to be part of is that same milieu. And so he was part of this general talent pool. And they actually get picked up off the bench for certain operations, et cetera. This is how the spook world works. And so anyway, Oswald got picked up by E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt, for those who don't know, and again, youngsters today don't know who Hunt was, but Hunt was a guy. In fact, he was involved in overthrowing the Guatemalan government, which was one of the CIA's early successes in overthrowing governments in '54. In fact, which led to the success of the Cuban Revolution, because Che Guevara was actually in Guatemala when this happened, and he helped make sure that Castro's revolution would succeed and not be undermined by the CIA and friends. And so, but then Hunt also ran the Bay of Pigs operation, which is now admitted to be it was intended to fail and intended to goad John Kennedy into calling in basically an invasion of Cuba. And this has come out. In fact, Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA at the time, he admitted it. This was this new president. In fact, the operation was in motion before Kennedy became president. And anyway, and Kennedy got rooked into supporting the Bay of Pigs operation, which is a disaster. In fact, Kennedy never trusted the CIA or his military advisors ever again after that. And so anyway, where was I going with that? Let me go back. So Oswald, again, he was part of this operation. Oh yeah, Hunt. So Hunt, and Hunt eventually became famous for his role in the Watergate operation. In fact, he was the guy who ran the burglars for Watergate, and this was after his official CIA days had ended, and he worked for. But again, it's like it never ends, even though he didn't have an official position. When my relative worked for Henry Kissinger on a secret team as a CIA contract agent, Kissinger had no official role with the American government. Oh yeah. Anyway, so this world is privatized, et cetera. And so even though Hunt was no longer officially on the payroll, he was still in the spook business, and helping Nixon get reelected. And there's a lot of let's say conspiracy theories around what Watergate may have really been about, et cetera. And so anyway, and that's another subject. But anyway, so what it is that John at this diner in New Mexico is telling the story about Oswald and how he got recruited by Hunt into this operation that was supposed to create a fake assassination attempt on John Kennedy and frame Castro for it to justify an invasion of Cuba. And this is in '63. And in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was in late '62. And so this is Dr. Strangelove. This is the real Dr. Strangelove, where the spooks were still going to risk a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Totally insane that they even had these kind of plans. And so anyway, and in fact, this is all declassified documents and stuff. Mongoose and Northwoods, which I'll get to. There were all these operations by the CIA and the Pentagon, et cetera, to try to create false flag operations, et cetera, to justify an invasion of Cuba. And this was happening again. And in fact, the operation that got John Kennedy killed was this operation. So what John said was that Oswald was very leery of getting involved in this operation until Hunt introduced him to high-ranking members of Kennedy's administration who were all in on it. In fact, the FBI was in on it. CIA they were the authors of it. Military intelligence was involved. They were all in the loop as far as this fake assassination attempt on Kennedy. And when Oswald was introduced to these high-ranking members of the administration, in fact, John Kennedy was not in the loop. In fact, this was one of many times when John Kennedy was not in the loop. In fact, this was the last time he would not be in the loop on these kind of operations. And so, anyway, so Oswald then decided, okay, he would participate, and what his job was to Gary said his job was to fire a couple bullets into the air, and then they would lay a fake trail to Cuba, as if Oswald had, absconded to Cuba. Again, part of the framed Castro operation. So anyway, so Oswald was supposed to, they were laying this fake trail to Cuba, but Oswald essentially would go into hiding. And what Oswald was sold was that he would go into hiding, and then the United States would government and the public would be roused to a fever pitch, particularly Kennedy, and they'd just go in and invade Cuba, take care of Castro and his revolutionaries, and then once all the dust settled, Oswald could come out of hiding and come home to a hero's welcome, because he was, a key member of this whole operation to overthrow Cuba. And again, you look back at it and you're just, the minds that would come up with these kind of operation stuff. But again, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we now know is the closest humanity's come to a nuclear holocaust. And so just, Strangelove, Dr. Strangelove was actually made with these kind of people in mind. And so anyway, and then so at the end of this conversation, now anyway, so what happened is that John said that everything was arranged for this fake attempt, and all of a sudden, Kennedy's shot and killed. And Oswald obviously knew that he'd been had, and so anyway, and that was kind of the end of John's conversation. And then what happens? He had this envelope that was actually sealed, had a wax seal with a thumbprint. This is a police procedure for documents submitted to courts to have them not be, a chain of custody, so they're not, because they can be, submissible evidence in a courtroom. And so anyway, so this sealed envelope was given to Gary, where John said, "Here's all the documents that are describing and proving what I'm telling you." And so, and anyways, and John began the conversation with, he said, "If I went public with this, you'd never hear from me again. I mean, I would basically disappear." And anyway, and so they get handed this envelope and this story, and then they get back on the plane and fly back, and on the plane fly back, Gary and I are going, "This is too hot for us. We can't. We definitely we don't want to become a bullseye target for all the people trying to cover up the involvement in this." And then what happened was that a day or two after they got back, Decker called Murphy and he said, "That envelope that what John gave you, you need to give it back now. It was given to you in a moment of panic." And actually, what's happened is we just found out that the CIA, FBI, military intelligence people who are all involved in the fake attempt, they see themselves facing the firing squad if their involvement in this, operation is ever revealed publicly. So they've determined that national security is at stake, and they need to cover up this entire operation. And that envelope is giving you a moment of panic, and you better give it back now, or you'll be destroyed. And Murphy thought fast. He said, "Oh, we tore it up and threw it out the window on the plane on the way back. We knew this was too hot for us." Which wasn't actually true, because Gary ended up with that envelope eventually. In fact, Gary later opened it, apparently, which I'll get into a little later. So anyway, so this is what Gary heard in December, mid-December 1963, that Oswald was this military intelligence guy who had no involvement in the real assassination. He was like Oswald said, he was just a patsy. And of course, Oswald never really got to talk, because Jack Ruby shot him to death at the police station a few days later, which was again, and that's when Gary heard about Jack Ruby again. It's like, oh, this guy, And so, in fact, to me, that was definitely evidence that the mob, like Jewish officers, were involved in the JFK assassination. Ruby's job was to kill Oswald. In fact, Gary thinks that his job was to kill Oswald right after the assassination, and Oswald was able to get away and survive long enough to be captured in that theater, etc. But Oswald knew he'd been had as soon as Kennedy was killed. And so anyway, so this is a chapter in Gary's book that describes this meeting with John. And in fact, in 1996 edition of Gary's, the last edition of Gary's book, he did an 87 edition and 96 edition. And 96 edition, John was dead, and so Gary revealed his identity, and it was John Tower. And the same thing, younger people don't know who this guy was. John Tower was a senator from Texas. In fact, when Lyndon Johnson uh, left the Senate to become vice president, to become president upon John Kennedy's death, um, the seat was vacated and John Tower won it. In fact, John Tower was a Republican, and he's the first Republican since in 100 years to win a Senate seat in Texas. And so anyway, John was apparently he was part of the fake assassination operation and was just as surprised as his other companions when all of a sudden, I mean, Kennedy ended up getting killed. But again, John was emphatic that Oswald would have never been involved in a real assassination. In fact, Oswald was also, accused, and I think everybody assumes he shot that policeman an hour later, and Tower said that there's no way Oswald would have shot a policeman. This was again, he was one of us. He was one of the good guys, working for the CIA on this operation. And so anyway, so Gary, he published his book in '87. I read a chapter of it, and then what happened was I moved away to Ohio in 1990 and started my studies. Um, it was actually the next year that the movie JFK came out, and this whole flood of JFK related books started coming out again. So it was like a revival of interest in the assassination. And I was studying so many subjects, and the thing is, I knew. So I read Gary's book and the stuff he described, and again, we had battled the same people, etc. I knew that everything that Gary reported in his book was the truth as Gary saw it. I mean, I knew that he wasn't making anything up. He risked his life many times. In fact, he survived a murder attempt himself when he was taking on these gangster judges and stuff there in Ventura County. And when people are looking for a reason to murder you, you don't make up stories, okay? Particularly something like that. And so, yeah, Gary. So everything that Gary said he witnessed, I I know it is true. To the best of his recollection, that was true. So he certainly, the John Tower conversation, he presented it to the best of his recollection. And in fact, also in the John Tower conversation, he said Tower said that Hunt was also the guy who was dreaming up all the crazy assassination attempts on Castro that the CIA tried, exploding cigars and poisoning and all this kind of stuff. And so anyway, yeah, so Hunt's mission in life, and that's what Tower said, was Hunt's mission in life was taking out Castro. And in fact, when the Bay of Pigs operation, failed intentionally, and John Kennedy refused to call in air support, etc., the CIA blamed Kennedy, really unfairly, but they blamed Kennedy for really not going the extra mile and, invading Cuba, etc. So there was a lot of animosity to John Kennedy at the CIA, etc. In fact, after again Bay of Pigs, etc. Kennedy said he wanted to break the CIA into a million pieces. In fact, he fired Allen Dulles over the Bay of Pigs, and so Allen Dulles, and again the same thing. Allen Dulles, he was fired officially, but he was deeply immersed in the spook world. In fact, when Kennedy was assassinated, Dulles spent all weekend at a CIA facility called the Farm, monitoring events, etc. So yeah, Dulles always had his finger in the pie to the end of his life. And this is that world. I said Henry Kissinger was involved with the spooks long after his official role had ended with the American government. But again, they're paying for it. So the CIA was funding Kissinger's stuff. Again, and so Kissinger was, working on behalf of the CIA and other spooks, long after he left so-called public service. And this world, if you really start understanding a lot of how the world actually operates, the United States operates, this is not big news, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, so what happened was, as I started studying, the JFK assassination back in 91. And I studied it for 12 years before I went public with my findings and what I did. And so I was studying all sorts of subjects. And when I started with, I said, I know that Gary was reporting the truth. And he reported that in his conversation with John Towers to the best of his recollection. I knew that. Gary, people like when we do the, yeah, if I ever made up stories, whatever, I would just be, I would really come to regret making stuff up. That's not my nature anyway, but it's just strategically stupid. You just don't do that. Yeah, you start doing that, and you give ammunition to the people trying to take you out. And so, people like me and Gary, we've always had to be, totally like Boy Scout honor truth stuff. You can't afford strategically you can't afford to. It wasn't our nature anyway, but strategically you can't afford to do that. I don't try to deceive anybody. Now there's stuff I can't say publicly to protect people's identities, but everything I say is the truth as I know it. So anyway, and what I did though was and there's a vast literature on the JFK assassination, right? So that's actually, Pearl Harbor, JFK, 9/11. These are the biggest events in the United States history, and since the Lincoln assassination. And so anyway, this is a big one. And so and there's been, thousands of books have been published. People spend their whole lifetimes, on this stuff. And so my contribution to the milieu, let's say, was what I did was I just said, okay, yeah, I'm accepting Gary's account is truthful. And then what I did was I did what I guess a scholar needs to do is I compared all of the best evidence I could find on the JFK assassination to Gary's account. And all the evidence that's come out, and I've done, a fair amount of homework on this. Not as much as some people who've made it their whole life's work. People who devote their entire lives to looking into the JFK assassination. What I did was much more limited in that I just looked at all the best evidence I could find, and I compared it to Gary's testimony. And I never, ever saw all the best evidence always supported Gary's story. And none of it ever contradicted it. And in fact, as evidence would keep coming out, it further supported Gary's story. And when Operation Northwoods was declassified, in my opinion, Gary's testimony should become the foundation of all subsequent JFK theorizing and investigations. It hasn't, unfortunately. And in fact, with the latest declassification, Trump, he declassified, probably still might be more declassified, but this was supposedly the final one or whatever. And the story, and literally the story today, which the leading names in the assassination milieu, in fact, Vanity Fair did an article on it right after these declassified documents. It's all about Cuba, Castro, Oswald, and the CIA. I mean, it's essentially Gary's story minus the interposed operation. So anyway, and again, it's like, and Gary's testimony is still like languishing on the margins, totally dismissed. And to me, this is insane that it's been dismissed like it has been. But I see insanity everywhere. And everything I look at, there's everybody's grinding their axes and stuff. And the truth is, often inconvenient, or truths people don't want. They have their own, like in JFK stuff. There's so many people trying to grind their various axes on the JFK evidence for their own theory. In fact, I've seen people try to parse apart the tower conversation to say, "Oh, this part's true and this part was Gary was lying or whatever." And people who do that have zero credibility with me. They try to parse out the stuff that supports their interpretation of the evidence. So anyway, so I'm going to get into some of the evidence. And in fact, and I'm going to bring up another investigator, a guy named Rodney Stitch. Rodney Stitch was a FAA investigator. In fact, he was a fighter pilot in World War II. I became an FAA investigator, and Stitch was another one of these Boy Scouts, like kind of like Gary, kind of like Ralph McGehee, me, etc. And these boys, and then what they do is they do their duty, and so yeah, and Stitch was an FAA investigator, and back in the 1960s, he was brought in to investigate several plane crashes that United Airlines pilots had crashed planes. And what happened was Stitch he found out, his investigation found that there were pilot error. That United Airlines was putting these basically poorly trained pilots in these airplanes that were crashing airplanes. And in fact, the one that was, I think, the centerpiece of Rodney's investigation was one where they dumped an airplane crash into Brooklyn. And in fact, what happened was that when a plane's coming in for landing and they're circling the airport, they're supposed to be going about 150 knots, just as a holding pattern. And anyway, Rodney's investigation found that this plane was going at 500 knots. Again, it was going like 3 times as fast as it was supposed to be, and the pilot lost control, came out of the air and landed in Brooklyn. And anyway, it killed everybody. And there was a few survivors. Anyway, and then what happened was that no, maybe nobody survived that one. But anyway, so anyway, what happened was that Rodney tried to. What happened was he found out that the FAA had covered it up. They were covering up in collusion with United Airlines. They were covering up what had really happened. And so this was the beginning of Rodney's awakening, watching this cover up of all these plane crashes and pilot error. And so, in fact, he eventually wrote a book called Unfriendly Skies. And so, anyway, so Rodney, this was the beginning of his adventures. In fact, just like all of us, we got in way deeper than we ever imagined we would be. And so, anyway, and then what happened was when Rodney published Unfriendly Skies, et cetera, he started getting contacted by the spooks, contract CIA agents and stuff started contacting Rodney. And Rodney got lured, let's say, into the world of the spook world and what goes on in that world. And oh my, the stuff that Rodney found out during his adventures. In fact, Rodney, like Gary, they all hell to pay. In fact, Rodney got kangarooed into prison. They ruined his life. Gary survived a murder attempt, died destitute in exile in Oregon. Yeah, this is what happens when you try to take on these people. And so, but one of the things that was interesting was that in Stitch's book, in fact, a later book. And in fact, one of his books, he actually described a bribe that one of my relatives took to push through a public works project. And what I know of the guy, I'm not surprised. And so, anyway, what happened was in fact this guy, yeah, I won't say any more about that. But anyway, so yeah, I've been able to validate so much of what Gary, Rodney, et cetera, really report through my own experiences. And so anyway, but one thing that Rodney reported in one of his later books, in fact, it was called Defrauding America, and was that there was a group at the FBI called the Pegasus Group, and they were a wiretap operation, and they would wiretap people's phones. And apparently, they wiretapped J. Edgar Hoover's phone. So nobody's safe from these guys. So yeah, so the head of the FBI got wiretapped by his own people. And this is how this world works. So anyway, he got wiretapped by his own people. And anyway, in the wiretaps, and Rodney had heard, and anyway, his spook contacts told him about these tapes. In fact, these tapes were collected and presented to a congressman who ended up dying on that Korean plane that flew over the Soviet Union back in the 80s. His plane, he was in that plane going down. And one of the many instances where I've seen the key officials and others go down these tragic plane crashes, and all their evidence goes with them, et cetera. What a tragedy. And so anyway, though, Rodney reported what he was told about these tapes, and that in these tapes, there were conversations that Hoover was having with people who were actually planning the John Kennedy assassination. And the names came up were very familiar names: Lyndon Johnson, Allen Dulles, George Bush the First, and Nelson Rockefeller. And all these guys were identified as helping plan. This is before JFK got murdered. They were helping plan it. And so anyway, so my take on that is that this was was their plotting became the basis for interposing the fake assassination attempt. And in fact, the people who pulled off the fake assassin or the real assassination, I mean, it was brilliant in that because of the way they did it, they would have ready allies in covering everything up at the FBI, CIA, and the Pentagon, because none of them wanted to be implicated in the fake plot because they would felt they would be implicated in the real plot, obviously. And so anyway, so yeah, so Rodney reported that, and when I saw those names, I'm like, I buy that. You know, those are all those people. The JFK assassination researchers and the evidence swirls around all those people, you know. And so anyway, so it all sort of comes together there. And so anyway, but exactly who did it? You know, my guess, if I had to put my money on it, was the Eastern oligarchy. Um, and Allen Dulles. And in fact, Dulles was a Rockefeller fixture his whole career. So ultimately, I think the Rockefellers probably had a hand in that. In fact, David Rockefeller was, John Kennedy's public adversary over Kennedy's policies. In fact, uh, again, David Rockefeller was constantly writing op-eds in the New York Times, et cetera, to challenge what John Kennedy was doing with his policies, which was not friendly to Wall Street. In fact, again, this is there's so many avenues you can go down on this of influences around John Kennedy's murder. And yeah, he did. Wall Street was not happy with John Kennedy. In fact, his whole thing with U.S. Steel and the steel industry, et cetera. Yeah, in my opinion, John Kennedy was not nearly as enthusiastic as an imperialist and capitalist as Wall Street and MIC wanted. So he had to go. And that's my take on it. But I'll get a little bit into the evidence, you know, and so in again, back Jack Ruby. So Jack, so Gary ran into Ruby and Mickey Cohen's company repeatedly. Had a conversation with us that are back in the 40s. And so, yeah, so Ruby was no two-bit nightclub owner that the Warren Commission, portrayed him as. In fact, the Warren Commission was really run by Allen Dulles. And this is what, I don't know how many people know this, but Allen Dulles was the only one of the Warren Commission members who supposedly didn't have a full-time job. And so, in fact, all the way Dulles, in fact, all the other commissioners, and you see the data is out there. All the other commissioners like sat in on like maybe 15% of the witness testimony in the Warren Commission. But Dulles was there for all of it. In fact, again, he was the one who was the magic bullet faction of the Warren Commission. In fact, Gerald Ford is, magic bullet Gerald Ford. He came up with that. In fact, but Arlen Specter is the guy who kind of originally came up with it. Working for Ford, and this is the Dulles faction. And there were actually, I think, three or four of the Warren Commission commissioners never believed the magic bullet theory. They did not buy it. In fact, that's a good place to start in looking at the evidence that exists on the John Kennedy assassination. And so, anyway, yeah, the magic bullet, and so. The official position is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot three bullets from the depository window there with that Italian rifle, and two of them hit Jack Kennedy. In fact, originally they thought it was three bullets hit Jack Kennedy, but there was another bullet that called the tag frag. It kicked up a piece of concrete that injured a bystander there in Dealey Plaza, called the tag fragment. And once they couldn't. Unless they had to acknowledge that there was another bullet that hit somebody, then they had to come up with a way that two bullets could have done all the damage to John Kennedy and John Connally. And that's where they came up with the magic bullet. Let me put this on pause for just a minute. So anyway, so what happened was when this, when they found the third bullet, they found more than that, but when they officially found the third bullet, again, back in, soon after the assassination, they had to come up with the story that two bullets did it. And so the officials, and the magic bullet is, So here's the short story of this. So the magic bullet, theoretically, what happened was is it shot Kennedy in the back, like on the right side of his back, and somehow it comes out through his throat, and then hits John Connolly in front of him. Makes several wounds, breaks bones, etc. And then and then this bullet, uh, after they had gone to the hospital, on an unused stretcher, somebody finds this bullet on the stretcher, which is looks like it's they call it pristine, but it looks like it's an undamaged bullet. Um, in fact, which they've never found any trace on that bullet of any sort of blood or anything. So there's like no evidence that it ever passed through a body. It was found on a unused stretcher, and then the official story is that bullet made all those wounds. And anyway, during the autopsy, they never actually try to even line up the back wound and the throat wound. In fact, if you look at pictures of the autopsy pictures of Kennedy, his throat wound. In fact, the doctors, et cetera, at the hospital where he was taken, it looked like an entrance wound. That was an entrance wound in his throat, and the throat came out here, and it was again, it was how to say it, super unlikely. In fact, I'm going to say impossible that bullet that entered into his back came out through his throat because actually it had passed through his spine to do that, and so it hit bone. And once a bullet hits bone, in fact, supposedly the headshot that killed Kennedy, where's that bullet? Well, broke into a million pieces, but somehow this bullet ends up doing more damage and somehow comes out in pristine condition. Looks like it never even, you know, saw any flesh or blood. So anyway, they call it the magic bullet. And so anyway, in fact, Connolly, to his credit, he said that when Kennedy was grabbing at his throat, and Connie turned around and looked at him, and Connie said that was before I got hit. And so magic bullet. In fact, Connolly was a good soldier and kept with the official version. The official version was three. It was three bullets, not two that hit. And then going back to, and again, as Audie Murphy and Bill Decker were saying, like so many experts, is like no way Oswald could have done that with that rifle in a few seconds and put those bullets in Kennedy like that. And so anyway, and then at Parkland Hospital, also supposedly headshot, which the Warren Commission said hit him right in the back of this. Well, actually, um, the Parkland, all the witnesses say that the back of Kennedy's skull was blown out, which is consistent with the shot from the front. So anyway, and then here, just this year, that one of the Secret Service guys, one of the famous guys who was there for the assassination, he admitted that he picked up a bullet from the hood of the limo when they were cleaning up after the assassination. There's another bullet he found intact. And so anyway, so in my opinion, Kennedy died in a hail of bullets coming from the front and the back. And the bullet hit Kennedy in the back, stayed there. In fact, the autopsy never even tried to trace the path to his body. And so it's to me, it's ludicrous that the one that hit his throat and the one that hit his back were connected. They were separate shots. So he got shot in the throat, shot in the back, and shot in the head. Some people think it was two headshots simultaneously that got him, but definitely one came from the front, which blew the back of his skull out. And then Connolly had his own. Again, Connolly was, he had several wounds from the bullet or bullets that hit him. And then there was another bullet that fractured the limousine window, which again is more evidence that's come forward like this. So anyways, there's evidence of that he died in a hail of bullets from at least two gunmen and maybe three. And so anyway, yeah, so the two bullets did all of that is one of the most ridiculous theories that's ever been presented to the American public. But it's still the official one. It's like, oh yeah, these two bullets did all that. In fact, this one bullet did all that damage and came out in pristine shape with no evidence that it ever had passed through anybody's body or anything. So anyway, pretty big stretch, real big stretch. In fact, what happens is that when you don't accept the magic bullet, then you don't accept the lone gunman. So if you don't accept the lone gunman, then it means there was more than one shooter, which means a conspiracy. I think it's the Washington Post, and on the ludicrous scale, this gets really up there. So the Washington Post actually conceded that, yeah, maybe there's two gunmen, but it was a coincidence. There was two gunmen trying to kill Kennedy at the same time who were unrelated to each other. They were just it was a coincidence that there were two guys shooting at Kennedy at the same time. Yeah, the Washington Post came up with that one. So anyway, so yeah, the official stories sometimes I mean, they must take the public for complete idiots to be floating theories like that. But anyway, they have to keep the narrative, intact. That there was some lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald who did it, and then another lone gunman, Jack Ruby, somehow was trying to a gangster, kills Oswald because he's trying to save Jackie Kennedy from the pain of a trial or something. Uh, Again, totally ludicrous to believe those kind of stories. And so anyway, so yeah, so the magic bullet is definitely a big one, which is, again, there's has no credibility behind it whatsoever. Um, and the backyard photographs, I put it on my site. I looked at the backyard photographs that supposedly, put Oswald as, he's got the whole common newspapers and his rifle and with the pistol on his hip, etc. And I think the evidence is pretty good. Those are fake photographs. Oswald's face was just pasted onto somebody else's, even though Tower said that, there were these photographs. And again, some stuff are like, some people may have been misinterpreting things. I don't know, but it's a thing where it seems to me that the backyard photographs were fabricated as a way to, again, more frame Oswald as the assassin. And then his again, this whole fake trail to Cuba thing, and this is I believe that this whole thing of Oswald being at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, his trip there, was part of the fake operation. So, in my opinion, what's happened is that the evidence for the fake operation and the real one, because the researchers are looking at it like there are two different operations going on, they've commingled a lot of the evidence, and I think that has contributed to the confusion and the three-ring circus around the evidence. Is that they haven't tried to parse that out into two operations. It was a real one, and there was a fake one. And so anyway, and so Gary wrote his account in 1987, and I said I looked into it for 12 years on and off, looking at all the best evidence I could find and comparing it to Gary's account. And Gary's account always held up. And I said Northwoods. In fact, I published my original findings before I found out about the Northwoods documents, because Americans generally didn't find out about it until this book was published in 2001 called Body of Secrets by James Bamford. And so that was the first time the public kind of found out about this Northwoods operation. And in fact, this year, I literally have seen the big names in the assassination community discuss Northwoods even. They even discuss Northwoods, and they still aren't putting two to two. They still aren't somehow relating to Gary's testimony. And it blows me away. It blows me away that Gary his testimony is ignored as it is by the assassination community, and not all of them. So again, there was a whole book written on this, and in fact, I think I may finish this with the issue of Israel's connection. Well, there's a couple other connections I'll probably talk about, but the Israel connection is one that has gotten a lot of play, particularly recently with the genocide in Gaza. And what this Israeli connection is that Gary actually originated it. And so Gary, in fact, back to Gary being a policeman, an investigative detective, etc. Gary, in fact, Gary ran afoul of Jewish gangsters in Los Angeles. In fact, one guy who was a particular thorn in his side was a guy named Harry Pregerson. And Harry Pregerson literally became a federal judge of the Ninth Circuit. appeals court. Famous. In fact, there's a freeway interchange named for him in Los Angeles. And Pregerson was again. Gary thinks that Mickey Cohen paid for Pregerson's law school. And this is stuff that Gary had found out, that there's all these gangsters as judges, and a lot of them are Jewish. And so these Jewish gangster judges, and this is a thing where Gary went overboard a little bit on his anti-Jewish theorizing, let's say. And Gary wasn't a scholar, but he was a cop, he's an investigator. And so anyway, what happened was that when Gary had Mickey Cohen under surveillance, and again, he actually also put him under surveillance back in the 60s when Kennedy was president. And in fact, and before that, before Kennedy became president, and Gary was putting Cohen under surveillance, and also again the mobsters, LA's mob scene. In fact, the escapades of celebrities and politicians and gangsters. This was Gary's life. In fact, the movie L.A. Confidential, almost a biography of Gary's life. And so anyway, Gary saw Menachem Begin in the company of Cohen repeatedly. And in fact, Menachem Begin eventually became the prime minister of Israel. In fact, won the Nobel Peace Prize. The ironic Nobel Peace Prize, won the Nobel Peace Prize as the prime minister of Israel with the negotiations with Egypt. But Begin was actually the most wanted terrorist in the United Kingdom for after World War II, because he blew up. He was the guy who gave orders to blow up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killed about 100 people. And he actually, part of the dispossession of the Palestinians, he was a key player in that, just slaughtering people. And so Menachem Begin was a bloodthirsty guy. And anyway, and Gary saw him in the company of Mickey Cohen regularly. So these guys were like buddies. In fact, what happened was they would go on tour to LA's Jewish community and try to do a shakedown to actually get them to contribute to Israel. Plus, this is back, in the 40s and 50s and stuff. And in fact, Cohen actually donated a warship to Israel, early Israel. And this is all in the public record. None of this is, and it's all easily validated. And so anyway, so again, Gary was around so many of these events that are almost like Forrest Gump traipsing through history. And so Gary was there. So the 1960 Democratic Convention, where John Kennedy was nominated as president, that happened in Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, and Kennedy's brother-in-law was Peter Lawford, and he was one of the Rat Pack guys. And so Lawford had a Malibu beach house. And in fact, at the convention, Kennedy took a helicopter from downtown LA over to Lawford's place for a pool party, so like a party. And that is where John Kennedy met Marilyn Monroe. And Gary actually was there. In fact, Gary, long story, years later, he found out how Kennedy showed up so fast, et cetera, and why that event happened. But anyway, and Gary knew that Marilyn Monroe was being used by these mobsters in an influence peddling blackmail scheme on Jack Kennedy. And so Kennedy was a legendary philanderer, and so they knew that, and so they no better bait for that than Marilyn Monroe. So she was introduced to John Kennedy at that Malibu Beach party in 1960, and Gary was there for it. He saw it, and so anyway, though, when he had Cohen under surveillance. And Gary actually had his own informer, a guy who spoke Yiddish and stuff. And again, Cohen, just like out of the movies, Cohen would be hanging out he was a boxer. Again, the racetrack, so Gary would encounter Cohen at Yiddish restaurants and racetracks and boxing arenas. I mean, just like in the movies. And so, in fact, Cohen had mannerisms very much like Edward G. Robinson. In fact, was life imitating art or vice versa? I don't know. But it was kind of funny. Gary wrote about that. And so anyway, one day Gary had Cohen under surveillance while he was with Reagan, and this was again in 62 or something, 63, and they were hyper focused on John Kennedy and his policies towards Israel, and wasting money on the Peace Corps and this kind of stuff. And in fact, what happened was Gary when they left that diner and went to and Gary tailed them, and they went to Melvin Belli's home. And in fact, at the home, they got the license plates of the cars that were there, and also Cap Weinberger was there. So Mickey Cohen and Menachem Begin and Melvin Belli and Cap Weinberger are meeting at Belli's home there in 63, I think 63. And Belli is actually the guy who defended Jack Ruby. So Belli was a mob attorney essentially. In fact, when Dennis was in jail and he was trying to get representation, Belli asked for $250,000 up front to defend Dennis. So there's all kind of overlaps with my life of the stuff that Gary had reported. And so anyway, yeah, so Cap Weinberger becomes, Secretary of Defense eventually, et cetera. And yeah, it was all, and this is stuff that'll never going to make the newspapers, all this kind of stuff. And this is one of the reasons I think Gary's testimony is marginalized as it is. And so then Gary, though, so Audie Murphy died in a plane crash. So did John Tower. And in fact, Gary thought they were related, and they weren't as accidental as the official stories are. And I think that after they died, sometime after they died, or at least Murphy died, Gary ended up, because Murphy is the one who Gary gave that envelope that Tower gave him. He gave it to Murphy for safekeeping. And I think Gary eventually got it back because Gary wrote like newsletters in the late 90s, and it looks like he eventually opened that, and what he found from the documents that John Tower gave him was that John Tower and Prescott Bush, who is George Bush the first father, were involved in the fake assassination program. And Gary said that the people who interposed it turned a real one. He named Arlen Specter and William Cohen. And William Cohen eventually also became Secretary of Defense. Those guys became senators also. In fact, Specter became infamous in the Warren Commission for basically his fraudulent work. Not only did he author the magic bullet theory, but he badgered any witness that had anything to say that contradicted the whole lone nut scenario. And in fact, it's come out that they even altered testimony of witnesses to have them say the opposite of what they actually testified to. It was all rigged up, right? To come up with this foregone conclusion that it was just Oswald. So to totally absolve the government and anybody else, it was this disaffected, communist kid. So Gary, because and in fact, Gary also had other evidence. There was and this is well known in this assassination lore, that there was a phone call that came from Ventura County. In fact, Oxnard, about 20 minutes before Jack Kennedy was killed, about somebody was saying Jack Kennedy was going to be killed. And this is part of the lore. Anyway, so Gary actually, he eventually got phone ring. Gary said that it was actually came from the law office of Jewish attorneys, and then what happened was that Gary actually gave that evidence to Bobby Kennedy in an alley in Oxnard the day before Bobby Kennedy was murdered. He gave the evidence of this this prescient phone call that said that Jack was going to get killed. And so anyway, yeah. So Gary then, he basically his arguments, and for me, it's like Gary testified to stuff he witnessed and saw, and then Gary, as a detective, put together his data and evidence and stuff, and put together his own theory. And again, he was a detective and policeman, so solving the crime, I guess, was something that he did professionally. So I can understand Gary trying to solve the crime. And as I'll get to, in my opinion, solving the crime is not as interesting to me as the main upshot of me from the JFK assassination, which is that if a sitting president could be murdered in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people and it's all covered up, how much power could a president have? And so, in my opinion, every president since John Kennedy was a puppet and knew it. And it's like, and been that way, still that way. And so, yeah, in fact, in my adventures with the global elite, et cetera, yeah, sitting American presidents are several levels down the hierarchy of power on Earth. They're just kind of figureheads. They really they don't have power. They don't make the big decisions on Earth, right? And so, and Jack Kennedy was probably the last guy who thought that he could. In fact, Kennedy was, and in fact, I've become more sympathetic to what Kennedy's his I'll probably talk about this more another time, but I get that he was definitely a lukewarm imperialist who was not a Wall Street's fast friend, et cetera. And in my opinion, domestic interests took him out. Um, However, there is definitely the global elite may have been involved at some level. Anyway, so Gary, though, his theory was Jewish mobsters did it, and you know, not there's no degrees of separate. So Ruby shoots Oswald. Ruby hangs out with Cohen. Cohen hangs out with Begin. You don't have to connect too many dots there to see Israel's potential involvement in the real assassination operation. In fact, they were one of the primary beneficiaries, and this is true. And they were definitely beneficiary of John Kennedy's murder because after John Kennedy's murder, the United States pretty much gave unconditional support to Israel ever since. And John Kennedy was, he tried to get the Israeli lobby to register. He was really trying to help the Arabs and the Palestinians, and he tried to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons. And all that got reversed after Kennedy got murdered. So definitely, Israel would have had a motivation to get Kennedy out of the way. And with Ruby's involvement alone, Jewish gangsters were definitely involved in Kennedy's death. Whether that means Israel or not, it wouldn't surprise me terribly. But there's this whole assassination on Israel that they're actually the masterminds and they're calling the shots, and the America's the tail, Israel's wagging the dog. The United States does whatever Israel does, and this is a big contentious issue, particularly on the left. And my take is that Israel may have been involved, but if they were, I think I see them more as muscle than masterminds. There were many domestic interests that wanted to get Kennedy killed. And to think that, Israel could have, outfoxed, the whole CIA, et cetera, and, turn a fake one into a real one. I just, I haven't seen enough evidence that convinces me of that. I don't think I ever will. And so my take on that is Israel may have been involved. And in fact, what happened was Gary, when he published his book in '87, he went to DC, went on tour, and actually walked into the offices of Liberty Lobby, which published the Spotlight, which is this right-wing newspaper that I actually subscribed to back in the '90s when I was studying everything. And it was definitely an anti-Semitic publication. And he walked into their offices with his book, and then with his theory that the Jews are behind Jack's murder in Israel. And so anyway, one of the journalists there, named Michael Collins Piper, he picked up the ball and ran with it and wrote a book on how Israel did it. And there's another work since then on Israel did it. And again, I'm skeptical that Israel did it. I mean, they may have been involved, but I doubt it. And then was what I think was also one of my interesting encounters with all this. And in fact, in my previous videos, you've heard me talk about, free energy, et cetera, and Stephen Greer, ETs and things. And what I thought was very interesting was about a decade ago. And I published my findings in 2001. And I've had, again, many encounters with this material since then. I said more stuff keeps coming out, et cetera. More books keep getting written. And anyway, in fact, the Internet Forum, which was considered probably the best forum for discussing this, education forum, I saw them discussing my account of Gary's experiences, and I just sort of joined the conversation a little bit. And I started writing. In fact, a decade ago, I started writing a series of posts on Gary and JFK, et cetera. And interestingly, and I mentioned that Gary had this federal judge who was a thorn in his side, and Ferguson was still alive, so I didn't name him. And anyway, and then what happens is in this forum, somebody pops in with a post, and they ask me if this judge, his last name began with a P. Yes, it did. And then he sends me a video of the guy, and it's like, yeah. And so Ferguson actually presided over the Snowden trial. And so anyway, the guy who made this post was a guy named Doug Caddy, and Doug Caddy was the original Watergate attorney. And therein lies another story. So what happens is that Caddy was actually part of the commission to reelect the president. The creep. So he was part of the reelect Nixon campaign back in '72, and he worked at a company there in Washington D.C. And Doug didn't know it, that he was actually working at a CIA front company. He didn't even know it. In fact, at the desk next to him was E. Howard Hunt. And at that time, really nobody knew who Hunt was. You didn't know he was CIA, Bay of Pigs, all this kind of stuff. This is before Watergate. And what happens is that he's working with Hunt. Then in 1972, he gets a phone call like 1 a.m. from Hunt. And so Hunt had befriended him because they were sat next to each other. And Hunt said, I got a couple of guys, I got some guys that I work with who they're in jail, and I need to get them bailed out. And Doug, can you help me? And Doug was like, sure, okay, let's all be there. So it's 6 a.m. Anyway, these are the Watergate burglars. Yeah, so Hunt ran the Watergate burglary operation. And so Doug was actually roped into bailing out the Watergate burglars. And so Doug got in way over his head. And he got off that case as fast as he could. But anyway, so Doug, though, he was friends with Hunt, knew his wife. In fact, his wife went down another plane accident, which took out a number of people related to Watergate. It's called the Watergate crash, actually. In fact, she was apparently a bag lady, taking bribe money and stuff and payoffs, and that was actually went down with her. In fact, the FBI secured that scene. In fact, I think it's the only crash site ever the FBI took over the investigation. In fact, they were on the site before the FAA was, as I recall. And so again, many of these suspicious plane accidents and all these kind of untimely deaths. And so anyway, but so Doug was friends with Hunt, and what happened was Hunt went to prison for his role in Watergate. And what happened was that a month before he went to prison, he had a meeting with Doug, a friend meeting. And so it was the last meeting that Doug ever had. The last time he ever talked to Hunt was then. And what happened was they had this long meeting. In fact, they had a diner in D.C. In fact, the spook world. So they knew that there was a booth in the corner that was wired for sound by all the security agencies. So you don't want to have a lunch in that booth because everybody's listening to what you're saying. And so they sat at a table more in the middle of the room so they wouldn't be overheard. Yeah, it's the spook world. So anyway, so what happens is that they have this conversation, and I think Doug knew this was the last time he'd probably see Howard, or at least just to go to prison. It turned out it was the last time he did see him. And so anyway, so Doug actually he started wanting some answers. So anyway, he started pressing Hunt on what he knew about stuff, and basically about JFK assassination. And he says, what happened? Yeah, because nobody with a clue really believed the official version of events, And so anyway, so he goes, Howard, what really happened? And Hunt said, he goes, well, Jack Kennedy was about ready to reveal national security secrets to the Soviet Union. And they said, Kennedy stepped over the line when he did that. And so anyway, and in fact, during the conversation, Hunt he would answer Doug with more like gestures and stuff, literally to avoid talking, to avoid somebody picking it up, etc., playing his spycraft. So anyway, he said that Kennedy was about to do that. And so what happens is they finish lunch and they walk out of the restaurant and they're standing on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. And then Doug, this is his last chance. He said, Howard, what national security secrets was Kennedy going to reveal? And Hunt said, the alien presence. And he turned around and walked away, and Doug never saw him again. And Doug, and again, Doug had me watch actually a 3 hour video of an interview he did. And I watched this, and you watch this video, and you're like, the last person on earth is going to talk about ETs is Doug. And when he heard that, it was just like, it was like it was the craziest thing you ever heard of, is that it was ETs. That was it. Well, how to say it? Not as crazy as it might sound. In fact, Doug was like, yeah, it's ET, but yeah, Doug's never said anything more about the subject other than this is what Hunt told him. Well, it turns out that in my circles, in my adventures, it's like that actually makes sense. And so my take on that is that, in fact, and this is not really controversial any longer. It used to be, but now I don't think it's very controversial. Jack Kennedy was trying to end the Cold War. He risked nuclear war with the Soviet Union more than once. And it's like, and Jack Kennedy realized that, you know, Earth's fate was kind of in his hands. And in fact, if he couldn't find a way to cool it down with the Soviet Union, then there's a risk that nuclear war would end the human race. And so anyway, so that's and so in fact in '63, there's a speech on giving an olive branch to the Soviet Union again, the whole back down of the missile crisis, and then nuclear disarmament, and test ban treaties and all this kind of stuff. And then what happened is that, and this is all publicly well known, is that Jack Kennedy proposed a joint mission to the moon with the Soviet Union. Again, as one of his efforts to end the Cold War. So there wouldn't have been a space if Jack Kennedy had lived. There wouldn't have been a space race. He was going to do a joint mission to the moon of the Soviet Union. In fact, since to come out, in fact, Khrushchev's son said that Khrushchev initially he was going to reject Kennedy's offer, but eventually he decided he was going to accept it. Yeah, Khrushchev was eventually swayed by Kennedy's sincerity in ending all this. In fact, Kennedy and Khrushchev were surrounded by these crazed hawks, all these military guys who, again, Strange-Lovian kind of people who would happily blow the world up. In fact, I think it was John Dower who wrote a number of books on the Pacific War and World War II, etc., post-war Japan, and he wrote a book on the American century and basically what an empire we are. And I read this book like last year, and again, it wasn't surprised, but there was a chapter of Dower's book which was about the enthusiasm for nuclear war with Kennedy's advisors. And this is and all the revisionist works and stuff I've read over the years. It's like, man, Kennedy was fighting his military advisors in the CIA the whole way. They were just constantly chomping at the bit. And Vietnam was a thing that, Kennedy was. He was up against it trying to defuse the Vietnam situation, and Kennedy was never going to authorize ground troops, etc. Noam Chomsky had a different opinion on a lot of that, and I respect Noam a lot, but I think his book on Rethinking Camelot was kind of misguided on why the CIA wouldn't have any incentive to murder Jack Kennedy, and so. Again, Allen Dulles was probably part of the plot. He definitely did the cover-up. So definitely he ran the Warren Commission, which was a really shabby cover-up of the assassination. And anyway, and again, in my opinion, again, the significance of the John Kennedy assassination was a permanent demotion of the American presidency. And again, you could argue it was demoted quite a bit before that, and I won't argue against that. And I said there's powers of control and et cetera way above the American president. But after him, I think no president had any illusions that they were expendable. And anyway, so I think that Jack Kennedy was planning a joint mission to the moon with the Soviet Union, and he was planning on briefing them on one of the issues that he had been apprised of as president, which was that there was an alien presence. There was evidence of ETs visiting Earth, etc. And in fact, Stephen Greer was given this document that supposedly is wiretap on Marilyn Monroe's phone which she was talking to one of her girlfriends where she was going to hold a press conference, say that Jack Kennedy had seen aliens, dead aliens, et cetera, and she was going to call a press conference and expose this. And Marilyn Monroe dies the next day of suicide, and so I don't know, how authentic that document is, but it fits, that again back to aliens. So I think my take is that Jack Kennedy was going to brief the Soviet Union on what they need to be briefed on for a joint moon mission. And in fact, NASA expected to encounter ZTs on the moon. And in fact, Stephen Greer says that Aldrin and Armstrong did encounter ETs on the moon. And this is another, wild story. And not that my story was not that wild, but apparently they did encounter ETs on the moon. And I could actually get into other astronaut encounters with stuff that, the American public, the world public is not privy to. So the things I've seen, the things I've heard. But anyway, so yeah, so my opinion is Jack Kennedy was killed because he wasn't playing ball. He was really at odds with the MIC, military industrial complex, and Wall Street, American oligarchy. He was really at odds with a lot of that. He was the best friend Africa ever. No president ever treated Africa as well as Jack Kennedy did. And Noam Chomsky have a different opinion. And I've read a lot of leftist works, on American foreign policy, et cetera. And it's interesting though when they talk about Kennedy or Latin America and Asia and stuff. It's interesting that they'll talk about escalations and these kind of things. And Kennedy was he wasn't the guy who was doing a lot of that. He was actually, yeah. In fact, when he did stuff that was, Chomsky would get on his case, Kennedy was doing it, pretty reluctantly. And there was other things like I never saw no one word about Kennedy in Africa, and yeah, Kennedy. I mean, he befriended most African politicians and stuff, which was, in fact, no American president ever treated him like that before or since. And so, anyway, so yeah, Kennedy was definitely, he was not an eager imperialist. And so, and many of his policies were reversed once he was murdered. And Lyndon Johnson, was the author of so much of that. And was he involved and he was, again, officially, he was the primary beneficiary of Kennedy's murder. And those Pegasus tapes that had Johnson being involved, not a surprise, and so, yeah, my guess is that he was. My guess is that Johnson, but again, who was ultimately was the author of it? My guess it was Eastern oligarchy. That's my guess, and so they controlled the CIA, and yeah, they were probably behind it. Be my guess. But again, I'm not that set on it. Again, for me, the main message from all of this is that the city American president's a puppet. They really don't have that much power. And the extent that the world focuses on what presidents do, again, they're not taking on the big existential issues that we have, which I have the answer. I know how to fix all of that. Free energy, fix all our existential risks in short order. And to me, that's one of the surreal aspects of this is that people like me, languish on the margins. Don't Dennis, been smeared in the media so many times, or Brian, or all these people, all get smeared and marginalized and murdered, etc. And the world chugs along, and people are pretty oblivious to what's really happening. And I have to give the American public credit, though. So most Americans think that John Kennedy was killed in some kind of conspiracy. So you got to give him credit for believing that. And it's not just, conspiracist mindset. I think enough people have seen enough, they're familiar enough with the evidence to go, yeah, it doesn't quite make sense. Yeah, the magic bullet is just, anybody really seen that one, if you really say the magic bullet, you're going, man, how could I believe something like that? And so anyway, so that's I have anything more to say today? Maybe not. And so anyway, so Gary though has my undying gratitude for what he did. And Gary, in fact, the chapter on Kennedy was just one chapter of, a long book that Gary had. Yeah, Kennedy assassination was definitely not the centerpiece of Gary's work. It was just one of the many amazing uh, events that Gary was participated in. And so, but that one is definitely, I say, with the most global import was that one. And so, anyway, I think I'm done for now. How long did that take? Well, we'll see. So anyway, bye for now.